Okay, welcome back everybody. Morning time, afternoon time or evening time depending on where you are. We have got a panel discussion next on efficiency in water infrastructure. The panel is going to be facilitated by Monica Bennett from the Global Infrastructure Fund. And the panel is composed of Monica as facilitator, Daniel Lambert from Arup, Graham Dooley from WUA, Lucia, Cade from Southeast Water, and Mark Pascoe from the International Water Centre. So please, panel members, come to the floor.
Hello, everyone.
Excellent.
Is everyone here?
Yeah, so Monica, I will hand over to you.
Everyone. Excellent. We are just waiting for all of our panel members to join at the moment, and we've got excellent. I think we're all here now. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our panel today on water efficiency and doing more with less in terms of water assets. I'm Monica Bennett. I'm the Director of Thought Leadership at the Global Infrastructure Hub, and I'll be facilitating your panel session today. So many of you may not have heard of the Global Infrastructure Hub. We're a not-for-profit funded by the G20, and our goal in life is really to help the G20 deliver on their infrastructure agenda. So this topic on efficiency in water infrastructure is really very relevant and very close to our heart on a day-to-day basis. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our panel. And I believe we have a slide up on pictures of our panels and their names and their roles as well. But if that isn't up, then I'd like to introduce our panel. So we've got Mark Pascoe, the CEO for the International Water Centre. We've got Lucia Cade, who's our chair for Southeast Water. We have Graham Dooley, who is the CEO for Water Utilities Australia. We have Rod Naylor, who's the market leader for water at GHD. And we have Daniel Lambert, who's the Australasia water leader for Arup. So many of you are no doubt living and breathing these issues around water efficiency. And more specifically, the rise of aging infrastructure presents a really unique challenge across the Australian water industry in terms of funding and financing the renewal of aging assets. COVID has obviously seen governments from all over the world trade off budgets in favor of the emergency response, which is completely understandable. But what this means is that these financial constraints will very likely restrict the ability of the industry to finance water infrastructure over the next 2 to 3 years. So our panel topic this afternoon will focus on how the industry can do more with less while still maintaining the levels of service and affordability across the industry. So I guess we'll start by defining more as better quality infrastructure that achieves ESG outcomes, and less as the lesser or fewer availability of public investment to water infrastructure. So I'd like to pose the first question to Mark Pascoe. Mark, are you able to set the scene for us? How diverse is the Australian water industry when it comes to funding and financing infrastructure? And what implications may this diversity have on achieving ESG outcomes?
Yeah, thanks, Monica. Good afternoon, everyone, and hello to my fellow panel members. I made a comment about 15 or perhaps more years ago in an editorial that Australia was running 5 or 6 experiments around the country in each state. Those experiments have been running for a while now, so I think we have some outcomes. It's certainly the case that we are diverse. Our structures are diverse. The ownership structures vary from all publicly owned, probably, but vary from state-owned to local government-owned. We have different regulatory systems in each state, and when I refer to regulation, I refer to environment, pricing, economic, service regulations differ in each state. So I suppose to hit this ESG, the environment, social and governance principles, I think we're going to need a different kind of reform to the reform that we've seen over that last 20 years that I referred to. Because our utilities in particular are quite well structured, or most of them are. There are fairly well-defined boundaries. Having said that, water is inherently a social service, and as well as that, it's an environmental service. So to some extent, we're inherently in this space of environment, social, and governance challenges. I suppose another aspect of this is that the water sector is actually quite stable. People pay their bills. So from an investor's point of view, this is, I think, water's a pretty good investment option. The other aspect of it being as social or as political, perhaps, is that I think this leads to some of our challenges in our ability to diversify our sources of water, for example, and the use of recycled water, because everyone has this strong feeling about what water means to them as an individual. So I suppose my summary, Monica, is that it's certainly diverse. In Australia, there's not a whole lot of consistency, except perhaps the consistency so far about us typically going to state treasuries for our majority of our source of funds. And perhaps some of my colleagues in the panel can start to challenge that as part of this discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. And I think that leads in quite nicely to my question for Lucia, which is, what does doing more with less mean for Southeast water? Which areas of operation do you think will be most affected, and what are the options available to address some of these challenges?
Thanks, Monica, and thanks for those introductory comments, Mark. Before I talk about doing more with less at Southeast Water, I'd like to add some framing to that concept, and that's about living and operating within our means, both financially and environmentally, and set that aspect to it for us as a water utility. And firstly, I'd like to just set some context so that you've got a feel for where I come from in the comments that I make. I want a bit about me and where I come from, about Southeast Water, and finally about how I see the state of the world in which we're operating and how that influences the concepts of ESG and doing more with less. So, I'm a civil engineer. I did engineering and economics. I've worked in the water utilities since the mid-1990s, and pretty much across all of the engineering sides of the utilities. I've also worked in the construction sector, in engineering, consulting, and since the mid-2000s on boards of water utilities, currently chair of Southeast. And to follow on from Mark's scene setting, about Southeast Water, there are a range of water utilities and structures and regulatory arrangements around the country. So my comments for Southeast Water, you need to understand in the context that we're a state-owned utility. We've been operating under a corporatised model since the mid-1990s and under independent economic regulation since about 2004, 2005, which means that our revenue and therefore our prices are set independent of government and independent of us as a utility. We put forward efficient investment plans, and the regulator then takes those and allows our revenue and the prices, therefore, that we can charge our customers. So that is the context that sets the way that Southeast Water operates. And I've got to say that every decision that we make, every investment decision that we make under this model, our customers have to pay for, because we're allowed to pass that through, provided we can demonstrate it's efficient and prudent. And that has an impact. Depreciation and financing costs 3 times what we spend on labour. It's over 1.5 times what we spend on labour and our external contracts. So those decisions that we make about investment are the biggest driver of our forward financial model and the forward costs that we provide customers. And finally, in the context, I want to talk about where we are in our stage of development in terms of technology, science, in terms of professional expertise and knowledge, and of society in general. The expectations and values of our customers, the community, and the fact that that's not homogenous. It is very heterogeneous, in fact. So coming back to South East Water then, and what it means to live within our means in this state of economic regulation and with where we are, in technology, I think it's best to describe our approach to that as, it's really encapsulated in our vision. Right? Our vision is that we want to support our customers with forward-thinking solutions for all and always that don't cost the earth. So the forward solutions is all the technology and the science. The for all and always, for all is that equity aspect. For always is the sustainability, and the don't cost the earth is both financial and environmental. And that pretty much underpins our approach to doing more with less, to long-term planning. So, an example of how that plays out is that, if you talk about efficiency, once you bring into the process the technology and the science that exists now and our ability to assure water quality safely at a smaller scale, distributed, and you've got the point where distributed systems can be technologically at a lower cost than the old way that we used to do things, which was to centralise everything. So when we can do that decentralised at a lower cost than transferring across vast distances, really heavy water, and treat it all to the same level according to the worst, waste input. Once we can do that, that efficiency equation changes, and that's where we are now in terms of technology and digital. So, that means specifically at South East Water to be more efficient, we're focusing on our significant investment in new technology and digital networks, in the meters and the sensors and the analytic platforms. And that's really significant. And so is the engagement with our customers to make sure that what we are investing in is something that they are prepared to pay for. And so far, our feedback from our customers is that they've got they think we're really good planners. They trust us to do the right. They trust us to do the right thing. They think we're reliable. And because of all of that, when we put forward our efficient investment to the regulator, we get approved. So, just finally, we can't do that without partnerships with others, and they are equally important to efficient outcomes. And we've signed up to the UN Cities Compact. That's founded on the belief that complex problems that we face can only be solved if you've got business, and the customer base and society, and government, us as a utility, coming together to solve the problem. So our efforts of living within our means and doing the best by customers and community have, in that context, with this unique set of assets that we've got, it does cover every aspect of the business, the forward planning, the operations and maintenance, and it includes especially input from the private sector, including their expertise and their investment.
Great, thanks, Lucia. And it seems as though the industry is undergoing a transformation at the moment. Transformation not just because of urban development and climate change, but post-COVID, there's this acceleration of digital transformation as well. You talked about investing in innovation and technology, and that there's potentially going to be a big shift towards decentralized systems. Are your current flows of financing and funding going to continue along the same sort of traditional routes of financing from Treasury and funding from customers, or is there a gap that needs to be filled?
Monica, I think because we think of our system as a whole, and that operates with others, we think not just of sort of the traditional assets, but also the ones where we influence, other assets and where services are provided to us by others. So, in our regulated services of providing potable water to people and taking their waste, that's under our legislation, but that's not all that we do. So, there are other things. We've got cogeneration of energy at our wastewater treatment plants. There are, There are other waste that we can add in to increase that energy. We are looking at hydrogen production. We've got solar panels. We are developing whole networks for recycled water out to other customers. And how we build the business case and fund those is where the opportunity lies. As Mark mentioned, we have, at South East Water, our regulated money comes from Treasury, but how we fund and do all the other things that contribute to that beneficial outcome for our customers is where I see we've got, the best immediate opportunity in front of us. Okay. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does, absolutely. And this flows nicely into Graham's side of the panel. So, Graham, do you think that there is a financing gap in the Australian water sector? So does the Australian water sector need private investment? And if so, why? And what change needs to take place to enable a more attractive landscape for private investors?
I think there are two forces, Monica, that happen to be coming together simultaneously, more by luck than good management, I think. And if you can say that the COVID-19 experience that we're all living through, and Lucia in Victoria is not even stepping outside a house, I suppose, very much these days, this is going to load up the governments of Australia with enormous amounts of debt. And that debt ultimately has to be paid off. Now, fortunately, interest rates are quite low, but I'm a big fan of the social safety net that state and Commonwealth governments have put in place for the people of Australia, and so the response is better. But as the state and the Commonwealth load up with large amounts of debt, they're looking very seriously at what can they do with projects that they have aspirations to do, and these are public transport projects, new railway lines, carriages, trains, buses, all of the manner of urban infrastructure that governments typically provide, like hospitals and schools and law and order and prisons and all of these sorts of things. And where can those infrastructures be funded by someone else? Because most of these infrastructures have some regulated rate of return. If it's not regulated by a regulator, then it's regulated by a contract. And that can be now at quite low levels. Now, traditionally, the investors of Australia have kept away from water infrastructure. And that's partly our fault. I think the members of this panel and our colleagues in the industry, that the whole industry is full of technological talk and lots of regulation, and notwithstanding that some places are better than others, a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of politics is in water. And the investors don't like all that. They don't like that combination, so they find it a bit impenetrable. But with governments now looking to see where large amounts of capital can be mobilised in at a low regulated rate of return, so that's a whole utility or a whole subset of a utility at a time, not just a single project like a Sydney desal plant or a Victoria-Melbourne desal plant, but whole utilities. Can you mobilise capital for that? And I think, again, a bit by luck, the answer is yes. The superannuation funds have not been happy with all the, what I call techno-babble, all this talk of regulation, all the other stuff and a lot of technical jargon that goes on. They're not happy with the kerfuffle over the Murray-Darling issues, getting into the newspapers all the time. They think it's a disorganised rabble of an industry as a general rule, which it's not, clearly. But by circumstances, the superannuation funds have managed through the little platform that I've set up, and we're the only ones at the moment, but no doubt there'll be others. We've been able to introduce superannuation capital into water infrastructure in a way that the state treasuries are happy about it because it's at the same regulated rate of return, and so there's no change in the customer prices. But also the superannuation investors are happy about it because they're prepared to invest very long-term capital at very low rates of return. Now, the superannuation funds have always invested in state government and Commonwealth government bonds, so they have an appetite for low rate of return long-term investments. It's moving that across to an infrastructure which is full of technical and commercial regulation. that's been a bit of a hurdle. And I'm happy to say that the 40 or 50 funds that fund us have jumped that hurdle. And so they're happy with us, and they come and kick the tires periodically. You know, the guys who do the spreadsheets, who make the investments, come and kick the tires and actually see what the infrastructure is. And we try and keep a dialogue with them to help them through the understanding phase. But it's interesting, the treasuries are now looking at this, and if they said, look, what about we get a co-investment model going? So it's a joint investment model with treasury capital and super fund capital. Does that make a difference? Can you make that work? What does the Tax Act say? How's the taxation of superannuation funds invested by having a joint investment? And they're the sort of discussions that I'm in now. And I'm pleased to say that the structure that we have in Australia is actually quite helpful in mobilising this. Now that's a bit by accident rather than design. No one in Paul Keating's day, when Paul Keating was Treasurer, sat down and said, let's design a system that might be useful in 2020. They designed a system for what seemed the best thing at the time, but it actually works. And we are taking advantage of that as investors we pay tax on the earnings we make, but the tax we pay and the structure of that tax is not punitive to superannuation funds. There's no double dipping and all of that sort of nonsense in our world. It's all very straightforward, but it all actually works. And I think when one looks at the Infrastructure Australia priority projects, there's a lot of transport projects in there, and there's a lot of other urban infrastructure. And I think the states will now be saying, well, how can we offload the investment side of that to a bunch of investors who are going to go the journey with us? And I think that day has arrived, and it's literally been only in the last 12 months or so that day has arrived.
Great, thank you. And there's lots of interesting details I'm sure we could get into in terms of the work that you're doing with superannuation funds. But how much capital would that arrangement that you have potentially inject into the Australian water market?
Well, we're working on a project at the moment that's $10 billion, where we have a dialogue with one of the state treasuries for a $10 billion capital injection into water infrastructure. Now, that's a pretty significant amount of money. When you think that the total superannuation pot of money is about $3,000 billion in Australia, then $10 billion is actually not a very large chunk of it. In this strange world we live in, I could probably get $10 billion and put it on the table faster than I can renegotiate a house mortgage. It's bizarre, but the bigger amount of money you get, the more enthusiastic the investors are to invest. And so if we have a very simple business model that we present to our investors that say, you need to be able to invest at the regulated rate of return set by IPART in New South Wales or ESC in Victoria. And they are the two markets, and to a lesser extent to ASCOSA in South Australia. But they're the three regulators that are really on top of this investment, irrespective of the source of the funds. See, all of those three regulators don't really care where the money's coming from. There is a regulated rate of return for that money. And I think if I were to come on board as an investor in Lucia's business, nothing much would change, except she'd write 2 dividend checks, one to State Treasury every year, and one to us and our investors every year. And we'd pay tax on that up the chain. You get taxed up the chain. But actually, a well-managed utility is what our investors are looking for. Now, unfortunately, Monica, some of our investments that we're invited to make are utilities that are not well managed, and they've got very old assets. And this proves to be very challenging. And this is where we work with Daniel and Rod and their organisations to help us with investment plans for things that are, in some cases, a fair bit broken. Some things are only a little bit broken, but some things that we've had a look at are a fair bit broken. And we have an appetite for doing that, but it's hard yards sometimes to get a silk purse out of this old sow's ear that you find in all the pipes and pumps when you go walking around and kicking them. Daniel and his team have done a number of due diligence studies for us of looking at looking at infrastructure that we have an interest in investing in. And there's been some interesting sow's ears buried in amongst them, and we're just trying to create a silk purse out of all of this, and it's sometimes a bit hard. But there are ways of doing this, and thanks to forums like this and the sort of technologies that are presented here, there's a lot of smart stuff around, smart metering, smart sensors. You can measure the impact of what infrastructure is doing. And so if you can see something and measure something, there's a good chance you're able to value it. And you can value it in terms for investors, and you can value it in terms that regulators understand. And it's a matter of joining all of these dots. But I think for the first time, some of my colleagues who have been around a few years like me will say the industry is really exciting with the amount of new stuff around. There's new stuff everywhere, and the Ozwater and other exhibitions have a lot of this new stuff around, and I love poking around all that new stuff.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of new stuff around, and Daniel and Rod are going to provide some great perspectives on that. But before we get there, just a follow-on question for Lucia. So $10 billion is a lot of money. Do you think the Australian water sector needs private investment?
I think, absolutely yes, there is an opportunity for it. And how that works depends really on, where it is and on what it's being spent. I mean, I'll give you an example of one, and there have been, lots of terrific examples of it over the years. And in some ways, I think sometimes we've just got to relearn, the success lessons of past years. I think of recycled water schemes in particular, on that front. That is one where private sector investment has been really effective at creating new businesses, new business opportunities, and better overall outcomes. And at the moment at South East Water, we're considering the Dingley recycled water scheme, and that is going, that's to take recycled water up through 5 southeastern Melbourne suburbs, and that is a $60 million scheme, and it will support golf tourism, which is $42 million a year comes into that region through the golf courses, and all the economic assessment shows that there is a benefit to the cost ratio for that of 2.2 dollars of benefit for every dollar that is spent. And, that is a partnership that brings together South East Water, the Bayside and Kingston local councils, and the department. And we're at the business case stage of that. And we're looking at a similar scheme on the Mornington Peninsula in the hinterland that is looking at providing recycled water to the councils down there, and with private sector agriculture. So, and for those of you who know South East Water well, we've got a partnership with a property developer where we've gone into partnership and joint funding for a residential development that is, showcasing a whole host of new technology that transforms the way the people's homes operate. So absolutely, there is a role for private capital. The big ticket stuff that Graham's talking about, but also the, by asset and by scheme, at a smaller level.
Yeah, don't be put off by the big numbers entirely. We are working on another scheme at the moment. It's $10 million, so it's quite a small investment, but it's owned by a couple of councils in joint venture with each other, and they're struggling with the capital demands of this scheme. So an easy thing might be for them to offload it, and we just take it over and invest what's needed in it to make it work properly.
Yeah, but I think the partnerships element is a really interesting one, especially if you look at it from the perspective of the recycled water scheme, enabling some value capture and ancillary revenues to be recovered there. This goes nicely into Daniel's part of the presentation. So, Daniel, because you also mentioned partnerships, and you're looking at investment trends and opportunities across the water sector that involve partnerships. Things like circular economy and waste to energy plants. What are you seeing in the industry in terms of investment trends and opportunities, and how are these evolving?
Thanks, Monica. And I think it's already been touched on in different ways by Lucia and Graham, but we're seeing the water industry evolve a lot in recent times to respond to challenges that we're facing. And those challenges are around climate change, urbanisation, livability, and one of the questions is how do we evolve as a water industry to respond better to our customers and provide better outcomes for them? And that involves changing from continuing to deliver the core business of clean water, but also responding to challenges around energy, challenges around waste, challenges around sweating assets harder as they age, and doing that effectively whilst managing the risks for customers. So we're seeing in that context, in both the urban and the industrial environment, there's a lot of appetite from the investment market to invest in the water sector because they can help unlock new ideas, and they can help unlock new ways of delivering things, which will create value for customers and create win-win outcomes for everyone. And if you look at the urban water sector, for example, asset optimization. I've talked a bit about sweating assets harder, but how do we start to apply some of the technology around that space, around automation, digital metering, sensors, analytic platforms, and how do we partner with the private sector more effectively around that? But Lucia touched on waste to energy. We're seeing a lot of floating solar. We're seeing SA Water go to zero net electricity bills, and we're seeing pumped hydro, hydrogen. There's so many different energy solutions being driven by the water sector, and some of them are to lower their own electricity bill, but a lot of them are to deal with carbon footprint challenges and targets that have been set, and to respond to broader mandates by state governments. So those types of areas around energy, waste, as Lucia touched on, recycled water, and Graham talked about desalination, these areas which traditionally in some ways have been non-core business, and some of them not being regulated, there's opportunities for investors to partner with technology providers and partner with water utilities to come up with innovative ways to do things that drive value for customers and derive value for actually the investors as well. So those opportunities we're seeing happen in an urban sector and in an industrial sector. How do we use water, for example, to unlock agribusiness? How do we use water to unlock and do mining in a more sustainable way? How do we use water as the catalyst for helping to drive economic outcomes in different parts of the country?
Great. And Rod, you're doing a lot of work around innovation as well. What are you seeing as trends in terms of being able to implement innovation through water asset creation and helping the industry do more with less?
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of enthusiasm for it, I guess, and I'm curious agreement here and mixing words with what's being said. I mean, I think the
Sorry, Rod, you're coming in a little bit choppy there. I think maybe you might have to plug and unplug your earphones, maybe.
I'm on a headset, so can you hear me clearly or not?
Very poorly.
Very poorly. Okay, we'll at the start. Again, I'll go through some of that. Maybe someone else can comment the right thing.
Okay, no worries. So I think maybe I'll put it back to you, Daniel. So which of those different trends or opportunities are you working on at the moment?
Well, I think on a recycled water context, one example which Graham alluded to before was is the Aquanet facility in Sydney. So an asset that was privately owned has recently changed hands, and that investor, FSI, is working very collaboratively with Sydney Water now to try and unlock a more efficient use of that recycled water plant. So it has potential to be expanded to 30 to 40 megalitres per day over time, and in the past has been running at about 4 megalitres per day. So how do we unlock that recycled water market, and how do the investors come in and help with that so that we deliver more sustainable outcomes and a more resilient supply in Western Sydney, which benefits the customers and benefits the environment?
Rod, are you back?
That's an interesting
sorry.
project. That's an interesting project, Anna. An interesting case study. It's where the owner of that plant, we have a contractor to operate it that Rod used to work for, Veolia. But here's an old asset that was created as a sort of a modified, corrupted PPP type project 10 years ago, and it doesn't work so well, and it doesn't provide enough value, and it doesn't do enough recycling. What can you do with this asset, given that it already exists, to make better value of it? And that's a very challenging issue for Sydney Water, and so we're in dialogue with Sydney Water to try and make good value out of this asset, because as the Greater Sydney Commission has painted a picture of livability and sustainability in its refurbishment of old industrial and residential suburbs, you need a lot of reclaimed water for open space irrigation and things. If your drinking water system is capped, which Sydney is, there's only a finite amount of drinking water in Sydney, and it's not going to get any more with climate change, it's going to get less. So we better get this recycled water bandwagon going, so that there is a better functionality out of our entire water cycle. And Daniel and I are cooperating, albeit with in a different corporate configuration. But it's a really interesting problem of getting better value out of an old asset.
Yeah,
One that's open innovation though, Graham. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah, we can hear you.
That's better. Excellent. Yeah. I'm not sure what the problem was there. We had a problem at the start, but I guess I was going to say, I think that the panel's made a pretty good case for the more side of the equation actually today, which is quite interesting. I think that fits with what you were saying, Lucia, about stuff that's beyond the regulated, and Daniel about ESG, about sustainability, climate, and other impacts. And I guess there's a lot of conversation about the less side, and I'm sure in this event there's been a lot of conversation about digital tools, digital capabilities for driving asset utilisation and life cycle to try and drive the cost side down to the serving. I guess there's two areas of innovation at a fairly high level that I'm seeing and I'm quite passionate about, that I think are opportunities to drive getting more first to drive efficiency. And the first of them for me, I suppose, is akin to what I think you were just discussing, is around multi-benefit infrastructure. It goes right back to the conversation I think that Mark started around the reforms that are necessary to be able to achieve that. But increasingly we're using integrated water management. We're thinking much more broadly about those other societal, environmental benefits and gains that we can leverage in the water industry, be it livability, environmental benefit, carbon reduction, heat island effect. There's a whole range of other benefits which sit outside of that regulatory framework in the large, mostly, not always. Primo allows some engagement and some opportunity for that. But I think that focus on deriving and delivering multi-benefit infrastructure and multiple uses, multiple gains, I think is a way to really drive the more side of the equation for efficiency for society that we work in. And obviously, as Lucia and Graham identified, really a fertile area for private investment, private engagement, private involvement in manifesting those opportunities. The other one that I see happening at the moment, I guess, is an evolution of the customer centricity of the last 10 years or so of water authorities. And that's a really strong shift towards human-centric thinking, design-led thinking. I think that takes us right back to the strategic planning end of the efficiency challenge. How do we achieve more with less? Lucia gave the example of decentralised systems and so the other innovations that are happening. It's putting the customer at the centre of our service solution, rather than starting with a presumption of pipes and pumps and a service that's prescribed, going right back and being very innovative and thinking about how we deliver that. And I think that actually potentially has a chance to do the less, to drive efficiencies, to drive customer engagement in better use and optimisation and effectiveness of existing assets, to generate more value out of the investments that we already have, but also into how we redesign either new assets or how we actually renovate and renew those assets to deliver greater services. So I think it does a great opportunity for driving the less cost, but also I think it's a pathway to those other great opportunities for driving more value, more outcomes, more achievement from the industry. And that is obviously there's a challenge there in terms of the regulatory environment and being able to do it. But I think there's a key, as well as finance, there's great regulatory opportunity for us to leverage that opportunity to create more for the industry. conscious of time, I might leave it there and give you a chance, Monica, to head towards wrapping up.
Yeah, well, I think we've got a networking session straight after, so we can delve into those topics in a little bit more detail for sure. So I might hand it back to Mark Pascoe just to close the session for us. So Mark, in light of what everyone says, what do you think the future brings in light of the COVID constraints on public investment? What change needs to happen now, and what actions do we need to take?
Yeah, my crystal ball's not absolutely clear, but I've enjoyed this discussion because I think it reinforces for me. I actually wrote down a word before leadership. The chair will appreciate that, I think. What I've seen in the panel discussion is aspects of leadership of not being constrained by the frameworks that I talked about that we created 20 years ago, and Lucia talked about the unregulated part of the business, and I think that's where the opportunity is. I've been involved in the CRC for water sensitive cities, in fact, for the last 8.5 years, and we create a lot of innovation. It's not confined to CRCs, but there's been wonderful challenging occurring, I think, here in Australia in our sector for a long time, and I think what this panel has talked about, I think, is challenging. This Daniel, the sweating the assets, the idea of getting more for less. We are moving into, I think, post-COVID, probably an environment where our communities are maybe more concerned about public health than they were 5 months ago. Where indeed there will be less capital, but Graham's given us at least 10 billion there. So
and more.
That's one project.
and more to come. So look, I think for me the panel's been really useful in exploring the what's next. I think it's exciting, actually.
Fantastic. Look, it's been really fun, and I hope that everyone attending is able to attend the networking session afterwards. So that's a wrap for us, and handing back over to the organizers.
Okay, thank you, Monica and panel members.